Hello, good afternoon. Afternoon, no? 3 o'clock?
Yes, yes. Late-ish afternoon already.
Dr. Tlaleng, I did not know you would be here.
So no, she's not here.
Oh,
But-
that was it's great we're not live. No, that was
No,
amazing.
our equity, the organization is one of Dr. T's projects.
Ah,
And so some of the webinars she's been in, but she can't be in all of them. And
of
so,
course.
but her Zoom account is the one from which we manage the webinars.
Ah,
Yeah.
both for efficiency and the illusion of her presence.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, and of course also because it records, right? So it records to
Right.
cloud.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So Jamil, I haven't had the opportunity to know you better.
Yeah.
And I just feel bad because I jumped off our call when was a Wednesday and I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't ask Jamil any questions about, what was your journey to get here to work with this specific project?
Oh yeah. So I mean, that is a lot of my my work is in critical diversity studies, and so yeah, I'm currently doing a PhD in that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so, but I mean, it's been a couple of years, so I've kind of I've also written some things, scholarly and otherwise, a book, also a memoir.
Wow. Yeah, I
Yeah.
like how you're saying all these things very casually, like they're all small, easy things. I'm sure they are wonderful things, but you're just being very humble about it.
Yeah, so it's so when Dr. T started the organization, she approached me to get involved, because obviously the content it aligns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so as you know, when you met me on that call, I was also contributing to the report, and sort of helped Dr. T put it together, and then sort of filter the contributions. So because we get a lot of inputs and information, but it needs to be condensed into like 20 pages.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's so difficult to do. So a big part of my work has also been that.
Okay.
Yeah, and obviously also just positioning the reports according to the values that she
Of course.
is aligned with. And so we've worked together on that. Yeah, other than that, in general, I write on, I guess the core of my work is to try and, one is to try and make scholarly outputs accessible.
Accessible. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A big part of what I do is to synthesize academic work and make it accessible. And then, yeah, in doing that, I write quite a bit. But the objective of it is basically illuminate how power operates in society,
Sure.
And I think a lot of us are, I suppose, indoctrinated into believing that things are just the way they are, and I guess a good way to put it is that what I try to do is to make people see that no, it's actually people who have decided that it will be like that. And it endures because we all agree, always use this example about money, how the value of money is a made up thing. It's a thing that we all just agree on.
It's true.
And then tomorrow somebody makes a different decision, and then the value of money is something else. you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah,
And
that's
it's
a
like,
great example.
yeah. And then one day, I mean, I know it's easier said than done, but I mean, imagine if one day we just stop believing in money collectively. And then economies will go up in flames and we would just live.
Yeah.
Because there was a time when we didn't use money,
Yes.
you
Yes.
know, and we lived. Actually did not die. I mean, we died of maybe like viruses and shit. But not because there wasn't money.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good example.
That's-
And which university are you affiliated with?
A University of Wits in
Okay.
Johannesburg. Yeah.
In Joburg. Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah. Well, I studied at Stellenbosch
Mm-hmm.
University, my undergrad, and then but that's when I lived in, I mean, I was born and raised in Cape Town, and Stellenbosch is in Cape Town. And then I moved to Johannesburg, and then, yeah, lived a little bit, and then went back to school at Wits.
Wow. Oh, sounds exciting. I also know that it must be a shift, Cape Town to Joburg.
Yeah, but I don't know, for some reason, and I was like 23 or something when I moved to Joburg. So it's kind of where I formed my community. I don't, my real adult relationships were formed here. So I
In
don't have,
Joburg.
yeah, I don't have an attachment to Cape Town in that way.
That's
It's,
so
yeah,
interesting.
I don't, it's, I mean, when I'm going there next week, but when I go,
Mhm.
it's as if I am in a foreign city that I've never been to before, but somehow I know where everything is. That's how it feels.
That's so interesting. And do you find that whether it's the politics or the energy of Cape Town, does it sort of stay more, does it stay more centered and stagnant versus Joburg is more dynamic, or is it the other way around?
Yeah. No,
Because it is compelling that you may have had more of your most formidable years in Joburg, but you still have significant years in Cape Town. But whenever you go back, you express that it's familiar, but not really.
Yeah, I don't. The politics of Cape Town are very stagnant. But I mean, you know, it's also it's the first site of colonial violence in South Africa, right? This is where they entered. So I mean, hundreds of years later, it still very much reflects in that. So that has hardly changed. And I don't have I can't do this work and then, you know, live in it in that way. So yeah, I mean, I can tolerate Cape Town for maybe a week at most, and then I'm like, let's go.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm just checking. Oh goodness, look at us chatting here. It's like
I know.
Oh gosh, that's fine. Okay, cool. Let me just get my moderating hat on. And then we can get started on that. All right. Welcome everyone to another Our Equity webinar. Today we are discussing, well, the topic that we will be approaching is titled Where to From Here, a discussion on possibilities for progress beyond current systems of oppression. And we have with us a wonderful panelist today, who I will introduce shortly. Before we got on this call, we had a conversation, and Ramya said to me that she's sending me an abridged bio so that we don't spend the first 10 minutes introducing her. So much appreciated. So Ramya Kudekalu is a lawyer and scholar with strong research and advocacy focus on anti-discrimination frameworks within international human rights law. She is currently the chairperson of the International Human Rights Committee at the New York City Bar Association and the Telford Taylor Human Rights Fellow with Cardozo School of Law. Her previous work experience includes research and litigation at the Alternative Law Forum, a collective of human rights lawyers in India committed to responding to issues of social and economic injustice. Welcome, Ramya.
Thank you for having me. It's
You're
such
welcome.
a pleasure to be here.
You're welcome. You know, I always find it very interesting as a South African to have conversations with Indian people, because I find a lot of parallels between the societies that have been created, and of course as a result of colonialism.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I often say I'm I mean the amount of people in India, right? We all know it's one of the biggest nations in the world, but I find the how gripped the society is by the legacy of colonialism so like mind-blowing.
It's
You
true.
know,
Yeah.
and that's why we have these conversations, right? Because
Absolutely.
it's really just not in the past.
No, not at all. I mean, and I think, being Indian means so many things, but the parallel with South Africa is, of course, that the Indian title is also an ethnic title. And so to be Indian could be be part of an ethnic or tribal minority group on the African continent. It could mean being part of diaspora, because we're such a widespread community, and it could mean having citizenship or nationality with the nation itself. And I think that, it's so true, the parallels about the post-colonial reality of being Indian is that the boundaries and the segregation that existed pre-colonizers and post-colonizers has led to some of the most fraught relationships that I think individuals have with their own identity. And it becomes part of the post-colonial reality, but also something that is so difficult about how we identify ourselves. And that's certainly true for, a big subcontinent like India. And we're still grappling with some of those issues even today, where nationality or nationalism is arbitrary. And that all of a sudden, because your colonizers drew boundaries and lines, someone who's on the other side of the line is no longer someone you identify with, even though they are culturally, ethnically, racially exactly you. And it's so bizarre. Jamil, you and I were just talking about how we believe in these constructs and how we devote and devastate to these constructs.
Yes, no, it's, and sometimes it's a little bit exasperating to think about it, and especially in our relation to this conversation that we're having today, because, sometimes it's like, is there an end in sight, and is there an alternative, and where do we go from here? Which is exactly the conversation that we're about to have today. And I think a big inspiration for this conversation is definitely reviving, and you know what, it exists, but I think it needs encouragement, but reviving an imagination project for what else, because we've existed in these systems for so long now, and some might say, and I think many people do say, it's too late, it's too late, we have to live with it. But I don't completely think that's true, and I don't think also that if we look at how systems of oppression currently operate, there's never been a time where people have passively just accepted it. People have always resisted this. People have always made very sure that it is known that this is not what they want. These systems are harmful, they are hurtful. And so I think for that reason, we must have conversations about, well, then what else?
Right.
And so perhaps I want to ask you, and I'm sure this is something that you've had to do a lot, not just personally, but professionally as well. But maybe share with me some of the things that you've envisioned as alternatives, because I think we must think of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important, but such a huge question, with sort of even deep philosophical implications, depending on how we locate ourselves, where we see our purpose. For me, I come from a practice and I would say a system that has been set up with the expectations of social engineering, which is law and legislation and policy, is the expansion and the extension of the human project around morality, regulation, and control. And it's been for me this question of what else or not this, something more, something different, something beyond this has been a constant battle being a practitioner of law, because I understand how violent the law historically has been to marginalized communities and continues to be in many, many contexts, that it has been activated and operationalized to eradicate. It has been activated and operationalized to enslave. It has been activated and operationalized to deny rights. And so there's something to be said, and I believe, one of the conversations you've had in your series about the master's house and the master's tools, and there's something to be said inherently about working with the law and working as a lawyer in a space where your imagination wants to transcend that. And it's challenging. I think that I have not arrived at an answer. It's a journey, certainly, and one with constant existential crisis and a constant inquiry about the value and the utility of legislation. For me, because quite early on, I understood and I made a decision that not only representation of practice was important, but representation in terms of grassroots work and community representation was important. I began to have a new relationship with the law than the one that existed. The one that existed was within the paradigm of what I had learned, within the paradigm of theory, and within the paradigm of convention and concession to systems, whether it's government, courts, police, etc. And so when I started representing communities who were on the margins of this space, I realized that their imagination and their utilization of the law was different, that it was both useful as well as dismissed concurrently. And I remember one of the earliest meetings that I had, and I was in my early 20s, and I was part of a meeting where lawyers were talking to a group of informal workers about accessing maintenance from husbands that had abandoned them or divorced them. And so the conversation, and of course, as a feminist, a young 20s feminist, I was like, oh, of course, maintenance, alimony, all of these are rights of women, and we should make sure that we get a hold of these men and, make sure we get what is needed for these women who are often income dependent on these men or had done so much invisible labor within the institution of marriage that it was owed to them in the separation and the divorce. And I remember sitting in that room and one of the women who was divorced from her partner, a cis male, who was a carpenter, and she was a domestic worker, said to me, I understand your passion, but she said, my husband, my ex-husband doesn't make this money. So I spend money and he spends money to go to court with you every few months to talk about resources that neither one of us has. And she was like, do you know how damaging it is to my soul and psyche that I pursue this from a person who I know doesn't have it. And she said, I'm not married to him, and that's a different question. But it also is something else to demand that this is owed to us as a right from individuals who don't have access to these resources themselves. And even though I say it so simplistically, and probably people are like, but that's so obvious that that's a problem. I never had a moment to recognize it until I had that conversation. And so, yeah, when we talk about law and the paradigms of law, we talk about certain resources. We assume certain resources exist. We make assumptions around access. And with communities, marginalized communities, socioeconomic context and question, and labor paradigms are always important. So what does it mean to represent individuals who have these questions, who demand these answers from a system that doesn't have the imagination for them, is really where the journey starts around the question that you asked, which is, what do we want beyond this? And I think, my sort of gateway response is that it is imperative in order to have that imagination, to make sure that there's representation and inclusion when we think of those alternatives. Many times I feel like even in the room, there's not appropriate or comprehensive or holistic representation of identities. And so when you're leaving people out, whatever world you imagine, whatever system is an alternative, is always going to be insufficient.
And I mean, yeah, this is the thing, right? Because when I think about, of course, law and the legal practice there's so many fields and specializations, and so all of those look different, and how it's executed looks different. But if I think about in general, how it looks to, or at least the image that has been projected of what it looks like to practice law, it's high-powered suits, it's briefcases, it's courtrooms, it's boardrooms, and so there's no disenfranchised, marginalized person that forms a part of that idea of what it looks like to practice law. And it's actually quite counterintuitive to think that laws and legislation is created supposedly for the benefit of people, but often the way people, like the way legislators and lawyers come up with it, is completely divorced from the people that it's meant to serve. It's created in a silo somewhere. And people are often spoken at rather than with. And the other thing that I thought about while you were speaking was, it's always important also to realize that to even approach a conversation about imagination and imagining something different is itself quite a privilege to be able to do, to be able to think about it, because it means that somehow, even while existing within the system, you do have the capacity to disengage for a moment, and I think a lot of people are actually, the majority of people are actually just trying to survive today and hopefully make it to tomorrow, and don't have the time, the energy, the luxury to sit and think about what could possibly exist beyond this, and I think that's also why a lot of people's, like the systems themselves, a big function of it is to constrain people's imaginations so that we cannot envision anything beyond this, and make sense of, because if you have something to compare this to, then you would start seeing, okay, maybe not this, but to be so wholly occupied by it is another function of the system,
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And you bring up something that I think of often, particularly because I was a legal practitioner that was responding or reacting to community needs, is that there was never the ability to cultivate, and I don't presume it doesn't exist. I know it exists, and I know it exists probably in grassroots and indigenous spaces more than ever elsewhere, is that there's no ability to cultivate concurrent thought of resistance and reimagination. You always feel like you're doing one or the other, but not both together. You know, we used to talk about our work as firefighting, and a big part of being part of the Alternative Law Forum was to try and do our best to take what we were doing in response litigation and incorporate it into meaningful research that is accessible, or you know, moving things forward in terms of policy reflection. And I found that pivot to be so sharp because I felt like research that was driven towards policy reflection was demanding reimagination, but I was so busy resisting that I couldn't cultivate that useful way of reimagining while resisting. And I think that really is necessary. The only times that I have experienced some iota or some version of that is honestly when communities have made and adopted creative practices around wellness, around joy, around music, around storytelling, around celebration, and to do it in spite of continuing to be living marginalized lives, continuing to have daily struggles, and to say strictly that both is possible. You can be extremely oppressed and still have moments of joy and practice joy publicly. And there's something compelling about that, but there's also something that those of us who occupy privilege and class fetishize about that. I've often heard, and I know you know, because in South Africa, you often hear people come from the global north and they say, oh, your children are so happy in slums, or you're you know, even though there's so much of want, I feel this space has a different energy. You're beyond the materialistic. And I think that it's condescension, but it's touching on something which even I've experienced, which is that people are able to choose joy in oppression. In fact, it is an act of revolution to do so, right? And we're having those conversations now. We're having conversations about wellness now. And only because part of it is because we live in a largely capitalist society and capitalist world, or operated by capitalist values. And so it's a matter of resources, whether there is access or not. But that does not mean communities did not have an imagination, or nor did they have the ability to concurrently imagine resistance along with another world, along with the idea that another world is possible. So I concede that my lack of being able to do both is because of my own limitations, and because you know, because I'm shackled to privilege and identity location in a way that probably the communities that I represent are not. And have already understand that all of this is a construct. All of these things that you say will save us, protect us, make us thrive, actually don't save us, protect us, or make us thrive. So we're going to do something else. And if you want to witness it, that's fine, but we're going to do something else.
You know, I think one of the things that you said made me realize, well, not realize, I know this, but it just reminded me. When you spoke about creativity and music and stuff like that, I think a big part of the conversation about imagining something new is actually, in reality, remembering something old.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because this is the way that people lived. Those are the ways that people lived. Things were about music and storytelling, and those were not nice to haves. You know, it was a way of life. Mm-hmm. And in fact, what we do when we talk about systems of oppression, those systems came to interrupt those ways of life. You know, but they were being practiced.
Correct.
You know, so there's definitely, and I've actually written something about this, but I think about imagining something like beyond here is it reads to me almost as kind of like, I don't know, in my head, if I create an image of it, right? This idea of imagining what, like on the other side, but the other side loops around to where we started, you know. And I think that these systems of oppression are actually just it's an abstraction of that view of the fact that what is on the other side we've already experienced once before, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's about there's and I think important to say also is that we must not romanticize the like pre-colonial times and pretend as if, you know, it simply was just utopia. I don't believe that. And
Right.
I don't believe that all of the way we currently live and the beliefs that we've internalized are simply and wholly consequences of colonial systems.
Right.
We had our own issues, and there were inequalities, but I mean, in comparison, and again, the consequences of it cannot be compared, you know. But yeah, so I mean, that is just an interesting thought that came up for me while you were speaking. And so I guess to move the conversation on, as I made that analogy about systems of oppression being an abstraction of a view to things. I mean, perhaps we can flesh out what that abstraction is made up of. You know, what are these things that are actually standing in our way? Because I mean, I have to believe that it's possible, you know.
Right.
I think I would simply I would perish if I didn't. But perhaps we can have a conversation about you know, what are the things that are standing in our way? I mean, what have you encountered when trying to solve things that come up all the time that stand in your way doing this?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, there's so many examples, but I want to sort of use, because Jamil, your work is also here, is looking at the intersection of health, law, and rights, and the role that health has played, again, historically, has played in marginalization of individuals, the way that, you know, essentialism on bodies, labeling specifically colonial imaginations of gender on bodies has created consequence of criminalization, consequence of marginalization. And there's so much that's happening in the public health space that's trying to redeem that, or there are people who are trying to move away from that. And so when we talk about, or when you ask me about a barrier and moving aside a barrier, another concept that we have to contend with is, what does redemption look like? And many of us, at least in those of us who are practitioners of law, when we think about arcs of justice, when it comes to acts of violence, we think of retribution, we think of the criminal justice system. And it's been the go-to for the longest time, that it's been just very easy to either completely eliminate individuals who've done acts that we believe are wrong, and even what is wrong and right has been shifting, a moving goalpost, right? So something that's wrong, either we eliminate them or we invisibilize them, put them in cages and lock them away somewhere so they're out of sight, out of mind. And so I think that even in health, there's been a parallel of that practice, particularly if you look at a history of how we've dealt with people who have had mental health challenges. It's been similar. It's been putting them out of sight, out of mind, locking them away, etc. And so those conversations are moving in different ways. And I think that's because individuals who are experiencing those are now have kicked down the door and have said, we want to be part of the conversation. We want to be part of the decision-making process. We want to be part of evolving the space so that it is equitable and it is with justice and recognition of our rights. And so when I think of what removing the barrier looks like, I think of, you know, letting people kick down that door. I currently live in the United States. I am from India. We experienced the pandemic in two very different ways. I came from a country that struggled and represented its struggle in terms of access to vaccinations that were seen as top tier. And then I lived in a country where vaccine access was easy. Top tier vaccine access was easy, but not only was it easy, it was then barricaded off to the rest of the world, particularly the global South. And I saw countries like South Africa, India, and others beg, implore, plead with global North countries to, lift that barrier. And then watch them continue to reinforce that. So there needs to be, when we talk about barriers, there needs to be plain and simple talk of power and where power sits and where power is concentrated. And I think that power, or those within power, will certainly not do it, and those without will have to do it again and again at their personal cost. And I'm not sure I have the answer to the way that we shift or we disperse those concentrations of power, because we saw it at its most acute in a global pandemic. If any of us were of any doubt of these lines, of these imaginations of global North and global South resource access, and whether there was an active restriction of allowing global South spaces to be to have access to public health resources, most acutely a vaccine, we saw it operationalized, that we were denied access. And I think that there needs to be accountability for that. And there are different people, there are different scholars, different activists who are constantly talking about it. But I hope that those who represent our interests through, democracy and election and adult franchising are able to retain that commitment to accountability for that. And that's just one example that I'm thinking of, which is the inequality of vaccine access. I know, Jamil, you've seen what it did in South Africa, and I know South Africa, among other countries, was trying to pivot to alternative solutions for options, that because it was not able to access top tier vaccines, which is compelling, but what was the human cost of that? And does the global North, do countries like the United States, are they ever going to be ever answerable to those lives lost?
Yeah, and I think, that also brings up another important point about, and I had a conversation, this week, the previous webinar, about, possibilities for health equity. And a big part of the conversation revolved around the realization that health and people's health and people's wellness is not simply a matter of, getting sick whereby something malfunctions in your body.
Yes.
It's people are made ill by,
Correct.
Like you say, being denied access to certain things, or entire systems deciding which kinds of people are entitled to it and which kinds not, and then that comes down to a question of humanity and who is considered human enough to deserve to survive, those, yeah, those are very important questions and conversations when we talk about power. And who has the power to enact certain things, and what are the consequences of that? And yeah, I mean, when I think about what is, yeah, I mean, I've obviously been, I think very few people in the world can say that they have not lost people to this pandemic. And of course, there was at the time before vaccines where it was just absolutely horrific to watch.
Right.
And then became a matter of just waiting for it to happen to me, you know. But yeah, it's such an important thing when we talk about health and the obstacles that we face with achieving that, that we realize that it's not just a case of the fragility of the human body. It's also about how systems of power, people who have that power, actually create the circumstances for one to fall prey to that, you know. But, and the other thing that came up for me when you spoke was this thing of people, and you mentioned it initially, but people just saying like, you know, we're just gonna do things our way, and we're gonna do it differently, and you can come along or stay where you are, it doesn't really matter. But even that, again, you know, those systems of power, they won't allow it for too long. So in many ways, also a big function of the current system is to force people to participate, you know. And if you don't participate, we'll punish you to the extent that you will have to get back in. I mean, I think about how, and of course, if we want to talk about, you know, systems of power whereby people are forced to participate, then I mean, the United States is a great example, and there are so many of them. And I mean, perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that there are certain states in the United States whereby it's illegal to harvest rainwater.
I think, yeah, I think there are some restrictions in some states, yeah.
And I mean, just think about that concept. How absolutely ludicrous, you know, like, and this is the point that we made about how people lived before. That is literally the function of rain for nourishment, you know. And how do you criminalize something like that? I mean, we know why, but it's just, as a concept, it's mind-blowing, you know.
Yeah. It's true. It is, you know, as a concept. I mean, I think as a concept, many things are mind-blowing. And I'm just, you know, taking something that you were saying, Jamil, that made me think of something I wanted to share, is that I also think that so many times we talk about oppression and power in binaries, but we actually live in a multipolar world, and nothing is more an evidence of this is when we think about negotiating and advocating for rights within common spaces, like, for example, gender justice, and delaying the realization of justice for communities because somebody else needs to be at the forefront. And I think this debate has been both vicious as well as needed, and within the feminist movement, about the inclusion of queer identities, specifically trans identities, within the understanding of feminism. And to me, just as you said, it's ridiculous. To me, it is absurd that the imagination of the feminist world, the other that we talk about, the imagination of something beyond the systems of oppression we currently operate in, does not include the trans imagination. I don't understand it, but there is an active location within specific feminist thought that does that. And part of the multipolar nature of a lot of these things is that people are told to hold on. People are told, well, we'll achieve this first. You know, let's get what we need for cis women privilege, cis women with class, race, caste privilege, and then we'll move down the pecking order. And people are done with that strategy. It hasn't worked. Where like people have been waiting and have never had their day. And so it doesn't work. And it's frustrating that we're now at a place where we're not able to come together and think about, and I don't say that generally. I think there are spaces where the conversation is much more healthy and sustainable than probably the spaces that I have access to. But it's frustrating that we've not come together to a point where we're still not thinking of like, here's where the power sits and let it trickle down layer by layer until it reaches very end, instead of just like disruption or dismantle. And we haven't gotten there. Even those of us in our own radical practices have not gotten there, have not been able to shake up that concentration, or not been able to think of it beyond the trickle down effect. And the trickle down effect to me is unacceptable. And so I just wanted to say that based off of what you were talking about, when you think about this, you know, removal of barriers and systems of oppression remains in place when justice is seen in a staggered way. When we have these conversations about this is a priority today, when we achieve it, we'll think of you and your identity tomorrow. That's oppressive. And you're part of that. And you're sustaining that system of oppression by approaching conversations around advocacy in that way. And I know it's difficult for my colleagues and comrades and others. And I know people feel like it's unrealistic to operate any other way, but I want them to concede to the fact that it's oppressive. You're still reinforcing violence by doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm reminded of, perhaps you would know who said it, because I hate it now because I know it's a woman who said it, and her name completely escapes me, but was talking about, I think, you know, like how unimaginable the fall of capitalism looks now, and then she said, yeah, but so was the divine right of kings.
Right.
Unimaginable that it would fall, and it did, you know. So just to the point of how, you know, it's framed as unrealistic and impossible. It's not, nothing is. And you brought up the word dismantling, and a part of this conversation that I want to have is thinking about the tools that we have at our disposal to dismantle. I think it's an important, when we have these conversations, we can get, it's a lot, there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot to think about. And so it just sometimes becomes an indistinguishable mess of ideas and conversations and concepts. And so perhaps I thought an important part of having this conversation is to actually name tools that we have at our disposal so that we can see, you know, there are possibilities to do this. So, I mean, what do you think about when you think about the tools that we have at our disposal to dismantle these systems?
I mean, there's so of course, so many thoughts, but the framework that I like to use, and it's not, you know, it's not an exhaustive one, but it's one that I wanted to provide in this particular conversation, was Iris Marion Young's piece on 5 Faces of Oppression. And the piece has been, it's one that I assign to my students almost every year. It's one that I revisit every year because I think it's such an interesting piece of scholarship. And it's, you know, even though it's decades old, it still seems useful to me. So Iris Marion Young names 5 faces of oppression, which she says is exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. And within these five faces, her article or her piece, her essay talks about how we, once we name the faces of oppression, how we then think about who the oppressor is and what are the forms of resistance to that oppression. And so for me, that approaching it from that perspective is useful. The other reason why I think it's useful to be able to name faces or dimensions of oppression is it's important as a tool of allyship to so much of what we've been doing, but what we've been doing wrong sometimes, particularly those of us who are very much in relationship with liberalism and neoliberal ideals, is that we think that there's an outward expression of disagreement or a Facebook post or social media presence for a particular cause is sufficient. And I think that an introspection about how those of us who hold privilege, power, and resources are uncomfortable in our allyship and should be comfortable with being uncomfortable in our allyship is important. And I would identify that as a tool. For me, as someone who not only holds class privilege and very often identity privilege, I held the privilege of being able to perform a certain role in the stage that was a court by virtue of having an education and a license. And it gave me a sense of righteousness and power as a representative, a lawyer, an attorney to be able to do that. But I have to have that taken down. I have to have that. So I have to have that either disrupted by myself or be told that that is not the case, that that is a performance of power, and that performance of power should not be mine alone in that space. Even though the space demands that, I shouldn't be unquestionable when I practice it. And that's what I mean by the tool of allyship needs constant reflection, and you need to be uncomfortable in your allyship. You need to be, pulled down a couple of pegs, because those of us who are doing so much of this work, once we're in spaces where we're able to talk about it, once we're in spaces where we're sharing about it, we're still sharing stories of the oppressed. We're still able to cultivate intellectual superiority on stories that are not totally ours. And we're forgiven for it because we're allies. But I don't think that that should be taken for granted. And I don't think that we should not disrupt that presumption that we carry. And I think that that has to be a tool of allyship. It's not a suggestion, it's not a recommendation, it's not a value. It should be something that should be activated for those of us who hold privilege and resources and are allies to movements. And also that we should be comfortable when we're not needed, when we're dismissed and we're told, get out. You're not necessary any longer. And we should be able to concede to that. So one, I will say that just to start the conversation off about instruments, and we already know resistance, we already know so many other types of tools of dismantling or disrupting oppression. But I don't think those of us who are allies of privilege, both class and identity, do enough to concede our own power, to make space, and to constantly do the introspection of whether we are being useful, whether we are being responsive, whether we're being of value to the movements that we claim that we're affiliated with. And even those of the most seasoned of us, even the veterans of our spaces should be doing this till the very end. And I would advocate to be, it's an unending exercise as an ally to introspect and disrupt your own space within marginalized spaces.
And it bothered me to know, and so I had to go and find the quote because I feel like it's important for a name to be said. And so the quote that I was talking about is by Ursula K. Le Guin.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Feminist, leftist, sci-fi writer. Brilliant. Brilliant. I love, Jamil, that you brought Ursula up. I love it.
Yes. And she said, so I mean, the quote is a bit longer than I recall. She says, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words."
Yeah.
I think that was actually, wow, I think it was such a great time for me to find that in light of everything that we've already spoken about.
Yes, it was, and it's perfect.
Yeah.
And you know, for those who watch this, her literature, you know, rest in power. She's no longer with us, but her literature has been really important, really important in reimagining worlds through science fiction, literature, and she's written other things too, but reimagining worlds that speak exactly to this, that speak exactly to the entire core of our conversation, where how do you think about utopia, and whatever utopia you're thinking about, it's probably not utopia because you're oppressing someone probably within that utopia. And her literature even disrupts the idea of utopia in and of itself, which is wonderful. And I'm glad you brought that quote in, Jamil. I'm excited that it was Ursula Le Guin.
Yes. And it's actually also the other thing that I was thinking about. I think an important thing to keep in mind also when we have these conversations is that we are not alone, number one, in this project of imagination, and very few things are new.
Yeah.
So many people before us have said these things, have done things, have offered us perspectives and tools to do this work, and really it's very much about remembering that a lot of the stuff already exists. We just have to pick it up and use it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree. I think now more than ever as a generation, and we'll have to be able to call to our past and call to our ancestors who devoted their lives to forms of existence and revolution beyond their lifetime. So they weren't able to see the fruits of their labor. But we'll have to do it as a generation, because I think we're contending with something previous generations did not, which is climate change, which is the active, ongoing, and speedy degradation of the living world that we occupy. And you know, I know you see the consequence of this in your communities where you are, and I see it in mine. And as per usual, it starts with communities that are most marginalized, that are experiencing the impact of climate change, whether it's you know, agrarian communities, farming communities, whether it's informal sector workers. They're facing the consequence of a living world that is quickly changing as well as working against us, and rightly so. So I think now more than ever, we will have to activate these reimagination ideas and operationalize them if we're going to move beyond the space of, you know, total climate degradation. You work in public health. I also do, to some extent, in terms of intersection of law and public health. And we know that historically, there has been not, you know, insufficient conversation about looking at health commodities and climate change. And we're demanding for it now. And we still haven't gotten the answers. We still haven't gotten basic tools or basic strategies to address it, but we both know that hasn't limited us from demanding that. So I believe you're right. I think that the answers lay within us and within our history, but I do think that we are dealing with something different from every other generation in the form of climate change. And it concerns me how slowly people in power are moving in response to it. And and how much of loss will probably occur, both in terms of human life and in terms of continued marginalization, until we do something drastic.
And that, I mean, the thing that comes up for me is, I think that is such a obvious consequence of this idea of trickling down, right?
Yeah.
Because you are not yet a priority. While people are waiting for their issues to be addressed, they are actually dying.
Yeah.
You know? And so, and I don't think, and again, that's the work of the same system that says, wait your turn. Wait so long that by the time we eventually get to you, which is never actually, you won't exist anymore, so we won't have to address your issue.
Yeah. I agree. And both of us come from countries with constitutions that have incorporated, as a part of their independence, socioeconomic rights. South African constitution has the right to health, as well as the right to a clean environment. I believe also there's been a lot of commentary and jurisprudence around that. Same with India. And then placing that within international law, there's been an expectation of progressive realization of these rights. There is this tension that exists that countries in the global South have not been able to benefit from the Industrial Revolution and not been able to peak in the same way extractive, exploitive countries, colonizing countries in the global North have been able to. So there's this tension of, why should we be held accountable for things when we're not able to benefit from the peaks of access to wealth? Our populations were not able to achieve that while you were busy, enslaving us and colonizing us. And now we want to play catch up. And I'm concerned that as a community and as a population, many of us are agreeing with that. And it's not to say that it's incorrect, it's to say that it's not going to work because it still aligns itself with capitalism and capitalist values. And we're not taking into account that these economies, many of them have peaked and have had the ability to accumulate resources to now preserve their environment, to now have laws and regulation on clean air, to now have laws and regulation around renewable resources of energy, of looking at alternative resources of energy to make hybrid cars or whatever it is affordable. And we're sort of only just taking those steps now. And so I worry that whether it's our imagination of development, economic development, or imagination of democracy, we're trying to duplicate some form of success that we saw among our colonizers and those who extracted from us, and we think that that's the formula that works when it isn't. That it is falling apart here also. It is falling apart in the global North also. It is decaying also here, and that to pursue that in a tunnel vision way is not going to work. Respecting that socioeconomic challenges exist, respecting that somebody in the informal sector deserves as much an imagination of wealth and opulence as those who historically have had it enjoyed, right? But I think that, for me, and we're coming to the end of our time, my plea is that we don't follow those tracks. We don't follow that pattern. We don't fall into that ditch.
Ramya, I could sit here and talk to you
forever, right? I know, same with me. I feel like you and me just chatted, and now we're just gonna make people watch us chat. It's like,
Yes, definitely that. But hey, that was definitely the objective. Thank you so much for your time. I know it's
oh my
quite
goodness,
late.
thank you. No, this has been tremendous. This is thank you so much for pushing me to think about this with this session. I to everyone out there, I don't know how useful this is. It's probably very meta, very physical, very vague, but I would be more than happy to be available as a resource for follow-up. I think if we want to take this into something more concrete, a case study, a workshop, or something of that sort, so that we can talk about these in more concrete ways, in ways that are useful to specific individuals or people, I'm happy to follow up and to do better if I can.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. And yeah, all I can be is grateful for your time.
Thank you so much, Jamila. I'm grateful for your time too. And I look forward to hearing from you soon.
Definitely. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.